Chapter 9, The Iron Boom. The sea did not want them, but the night demanded them.
The great autumn fleet of the Hardanger left the Ormtongue under a sky that had no stars.
80 hulls slipped into the black swell, their oars wrapped in old rags where they met the rowlocks to deaden the telltale creak slap of wood on wood. They looked less like an armada and more like a long, fragmented shadow drifting across the mouth of the fjord. Thorstein Sigurdsson sat at the steering oar of the Naglfar's wake.
His left arm was useless, bound beneath his tunic, but his right hand held the pine tiller with a grip that had grown as hard as a salt-cured anchor line. Behind him, 30 men rowed in absolute silence, their heads bowed against the freezing drizzle that turned into needles of ice as it touched their wool cloaks. "The fog is holding, uncle," Halvar whispered from the middle deck. The boy was crouching by the mast step, a bundle of dry tinder and a grease-soaked sheepskin tucked under his arm. His face was smeared with old charcoal, leaving only the whites of his eyes visible in the gloom. "It's too thick," Thorstein muttered, his eyes straining against the grey wool of the night. "If the tide shifts before we clear the headland, the current will throw Thorkel's fishing boats onto the rocks of the Black Sister. Tell the port oars to back water 3 strokes. We need to stay in the throat of the channel." 2 leagues ahead, hidden by the dense sea mist that smelled of rotten kelp and river mud, lay Alrekstad, the seat of Jarl Eric's power. The harbor was a natural iron pot, guarded by 2 massive towers of fitted granite that the Jarl's grandfather had built using English slaves. Between these towers ran the Jarnstam, the iron boom, a massive chain of forged links, each as thick as a horse's thigh, resting just beneath the surface of the water. If a longship struck the chain at full row, the prow would split like dry cedar, leaving the crew to drown in their mail shirts while the Jarl's archers shot them from the parapets.
The silent land.
Half an hour before midnight, the prow of Thorstein's skiff ground softly into the black mud of the outer salt marshes, 200 paces west of the left harbor tower. There was no sound from the land save for the rhythmic chug-chug of the tide against the reeds. The great stone tower loomed through the mist like a blind giant, its lower arrow slits dark, though a single, dull yellow eye flickered at the very top where the watchmen kept their tallow brazier. "Halvar," Thorstein said, his voice barely a breath against the wind.
"The Norns have given you your night.
If you fail to break the capstan, the fleet will be broken on the iron before the first oarstroke of dawn."
Halvar didn't look back.
He slipped over the gunwale into the waist-deep black water, his short sax held between his teeth to keep it from clinking against his belt buckle. Behind him came 6 men, boys from the Hardanger who had grown up hunting the cliff goats of the High Scree, men who could climb stone without using their hands.
Thorstein watched them vanish into the grey reed beds.
Then he turned to Kveldolv, who sat on the forward bench, his massive 5-foot axe resting between his knees like a sleeping dog. "If the fire doesn't light in the tower by the time the tide turns, Kveldolv," Thorstein said softly, "we row the wake straight into the gatehouses.
We don't wait for the chain."
"I've always wanted to see how much stone an ash prow can break," Kveldolv rumbled, his great fingers tracing the iron runes carved into his axe heel.
The teeth of the stone.
The climb up the western face of the left tower was a matter of skin and spit. The stones were wet with sea spray, covered in a slick green moss that had grown during the winter rains. Halvar led, his bare toes finding the narrow gaps where the mortar had rotted away. His fingers were raw, the nails bleeding where he had jammed them into the flint cracks to hold his weight against the wind that tried to rip him from the wall. He reached the first arrow slit 20 feet above the mud. He paused, his breath rattling in his throat, listening. Inside, 2 of the Jarl's guards were talking, their voices muffled by the heavy stone walls. They were rolling sheep bones on an old shield boss, arguing over a silver penny that had been clipped into 3 pieces. "The old man won't last the summer," one grunted.
"Sigurd's dead, Haldar's dead.
The Hardanger wolves are eating the sheep on the borders, and Eric just sits in his high seat sniffing foreign oils."
"The Hardanger men are broken," the second voice replied with a coarse laugh.
"They have no ships left but fishing boats. If they come here, the chain will give the crabs a feast they won't forget before the winter."
Halvar didn't wait to hear the rest.
He hoisted his body through the narrow slit, his leather boots making a faint scuff as he hit the stone floor inside. The 2 guards turned, their mouths opening to roar, but Halvar's sax was already out. He lunged forward from his knees, driving the broad blade straight into the stomach of the nearest man, twisting it until the iron struck the backbone. The second guard scrambled for his spear, but one of the Hardinja boys, a lad named Torvig, dropped through the arrow slit behind Halvar, his heavy iron club coming down across the guard's temple with a sound like a wet hide being beaten against a rock. The room went quiet again, save for the heavy, wet breathing of the dying man on the floor.
The fire in the iron. In the center of the tower floor stood the Kvikr, the great oak capstan that held the end of the harbor chain. It was a massive drum of seasoned timber, 6 feet thick, bound with heavy bands of iron and held in place by 3 massive iron pawls that clicked into a stone gear ring in the floor. The fat, Halvar hissed, his hands shaking as he pulled the grease-soaked sheepskin from his tunic.
Pour it over the tallow gears. Quick! The boys emptied their flasks of whale oil over the dry wood of the drum, stuffing the gaps between the oak teeth with old moss and tar rags. Halvar reached up to the wall bracket, took the single burning tallow torch, and dropped it into the heart of the grease. The fire did not catch slowly, it caught with a violent, blue whoosh that filled the stone room with a blinding, oily smoke. The grease-cooked wood began to crackle and pop, the heat rising so fast that the skin on Halvar's face began to blister before he could reach the narrow staircase that led to the upper parapet.
Clang!
The first iron pawl, softened by the intense heat and strained by the immense weight of the 300-foot chain pulling from the deep water outside, snapped with a sound that vibrated through the foundation of the tower.
Then came the second. Then the third.
With a long, shrieking groan of metal on stone, the great oak drum split down the center. The massive harbor chain, no longer held by the gears, began to rush backward through the wallport, its iron links throwing a great arc of green sparks into the night as it plunged into the deep muck of the harbor floor. Outside, on the black waters of the fjord, Torstein Sigurdsson saw the orange glow burst from the lower slits of the stone giant. He lifted his right arm, his voice rising above the roar of the surf as he let go of the tiller and drew Viper's tongue from his belt.
The chain is down. Torstein bellowed into the mist.
80 ships.
Raise the sails. Let the Jarl see the color of our wool. Chapter 10, The Dragon's Teeth.
The harbor of Alrekstad did not catch fire, it exploded into a landscape of grease and screaming iron. As the left tower flared into a column of thick, blue-black whale oil smoke, the iron boom chain dropped into the black mud of the seafloor with a final, echoing splash. The 60-foot dragon ships of Jarl Erik, tied side by side along the stone piers like fat sheepen and winter pen, were suddenly exposed. They had no room to swing their prows, no water to build the speed of their oars. They were a hallowed, expensive forest of carved timber waiting for the axe.
No arrows. Torstein Sigurdsson bellowed from the prow of the Naglfar's wake. He had dropped his blue cloak into the bilge, his right hand was locked around the dry oak haft of Viper's tongue, his teeth bared against the sudden glare of the burning tower. Give them the iron. Ram them where the planks meet the water. The wake did not hesitate.
Driven by 30 oarsmen who had spent 3 winters chewing dry stockfish and dreaming of this mud, the ash prow hit the centerboard of the Jarl's leading patrol boat, the Gullslayer. The sound was not a smash, it was a long, splintering shriek of green oak parting under the weight of 3 tons of hard-driven pine. The Gullslayer split down its third strake, the freezing black water of the harbor rushing into its belly so fast the oarsmen on the lower benches didn't even have the time to unbuckle their leather thigh straps before the cold took them.
Hardinja!
Kveldulv roared, jumping from the rail before the 2 hulls had even finished grinding together. He landed on the tilted deck of a secondary longship, his great Danax catching an enemy captain across the noseguard before the man could draw his sacks. The gate is down, boys.
Come and get your silver. The fight on the planks.
The harbor became a sprawling, multi-tiered slaughterhouse. There were no lines, no fields, and no walls. The fighting was fought on narrow stone piers 5 paces wide, on the buckled decks of half-sunk ships, and across the grease-slicked timbers of the fish-gutting stages. Torstein stepped onto the pier, his left arm throbbing beneath his linen bindings like a hot ember. A huskarl clad in a bright, southern coat of ringmail stepped from the shadow of a grain store, lunging with a broad-bladed boar spear.
The thrust was fast, aimed at Torstein's unarmored ribs. Torstein didn't look at the iron tip. He looked at the man's feet.
As the spear point split his wool tunic, Torstein pivoted his weight onto his heels, letting the shaft slide beneath his armpit, and brought the heavy beard of Viper's tongue down on the ash wood. The spear shaft snapped with a sharp clack. Before the Huskarl could draw his short sword, Thorstein stepped inside his guard, driving the iron butt spike of his axe straight into the man's throat-piece. The iron rings burst inward, burying themselves in the soft flesh of the windpipe.
Halvar!
Thorstein shouted, spitting a mouthful of black soot onto the stones.
Keep the pier head. Don't let them form the wedge.
From the burning tower behind them, Halvar and the 40 boys of the vanguard came running down the wooden steps, their swords wet, their faces blackened until they looked like the Dokalfar, the dark elves of the deep earth. They carried no heavy shields, but they moved with the frantic, starving speed of youngsters who knew that if they stopped running, the iron would find them. The shield wall of the dead. At the base of the high path leading up to the Jarl's great hall, 30 of Eric's personal guard had managed to form a tight, 3-rank skjoldborg. Their shields were not lindenwood, they were heavy, iron-plated discs of old ash, painted with the grey wolf of Alrekstad. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their long broadswords resting on the upper rims of their shields like the teeth of a giant trap.
We can't break that from the front, Sigurdsson.
Thorkel the Tall yelled, his long arm wiping a smear of blood and brain matter from his remaining ear. He had brought 20 of his Sunfjord men up from the beach, but 3 of them were already crawling on the stones, their legs ruined by arrows from the high parapets.
It's too tight.
Every time we hit them, their spears poke through the grease. Then we don't use the iron, Thorstein said, his grey eyes catching the reflection of a burning oil vat that had tipped over near the fishhouses. He looked up toward the high ridge, where the dark shapes of the Lfnar were still descending from the hills like smoke from a peat fire. They were not running toward the ships, they were moving toward the Jarl's horse stables behind the hall.
Kveldolv! Take the left flank by the drying nets.
Thorstein ordered, his voice dropping into that cold, rhythmic rumble that meant the old man had forgotten his pain.
Thorkel, keep their eyes on the center. Halvar, with me.
Thorstein broke into a limping run, not toward the shield wall, but toward the side of the fish-gutting sheds where 3 heavy barrels of whale tallow were resting on an old sled. The wood of the barrels was dry, seeping old grease into the dirt. With a single, violent kick of his right boot, Thorstein knocked the iron hoop from the central barrel. The black, rancid oil poured out across the stone path, running down the slope straight toward the feet of the Jarl's disciplined Huskarls.
Fire!
Halvar screamed, dropping his shield and throwing a burning pine knot into the oil slick.
The path became a river of yellow flame within 3 heartbeats.
The heat rose with a terrifying roar, the grease catching the wool trousers of the men in the front rank of the shield wall.
The discipline broke.
Men began to scream, not the battle cries of the old days, but the frantic, high shriek of living meat being cooked inside its own iron skin.
The wall split open. Now!
Thorstein bellowed, lifting Viper's tongue high as he charged into the smoke.
Hardinja! Hit them before they reach the mud. Chapter 11, The Slippery Throne.
The path to the Jarl's hall was no longer made of stone. It was a slurry of melted grease, scorched wool, and the dark, thick mud of the high yards.
Thorstein Sigurdsson did not check to see who followed him through the smoke.
He knew the cadence of Kveldolv's booming breaths to his left, and he could hear the lighter, faster scuff of Halvar's boots directly behind. Everything else was a red blur, punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic clack-thud of Viper's tongue clearing a path through the retreating guard. The great hall of Alrekstad sat upon the highest terrace of the town, a monstrous structure of blackened oak that looked like a sleeping whale beast. Its doors were 5 paces high, carved with the ancient, intertwined forms of the world serpent chewing its own tail. But the doors were not barred. They hung loosely on their massive bronze hinges, creaking in the hot wind that rose from the burning harbor below. "It's a trap, Thorstein," Kveldolv grunted, wiping a smear of dark tallow from his eyes with his forearm. He leaned against his long axe, his chest heaving like a blacksmith's bellows. The old fox wouldn't leave his den wide open unless he had 50 spears waiting behind the timber. "If he has 50 spears, he has 50 men who can bleed," Thorstein said, his voice dropping into that cold, flat tone that left no room for hesitation. He kicked the left door open with his right boot. The great hall was silent. It did not smell of meat or roasted marrow, as a Jarl's hall should. It smelled of frankincense, sour wine, and the dry, dusty scent of old parchment. Down the center of the 80-pace room ran a double row of massive pine pillars, each one carved with the faces of the old gods, but the faces had been defaced, hacked away with iron chisels to make room for small, silver-plated crosses that gleamed dully in the torchlight. At the far end of the long hall, sitting on a high seat of carved ashwood that had been painted a dark, funereal blue, sat Jarl Erik, the king of the ledger. The Jarl was not the monster of the sagas. He was an old man, 60 winters old, his body shrunk within a heavy gown of purple cloth that had been brought by merchant ships from the southern empires. His legs were wrapped in white bandages, swollen and useless from the bone rot, and his fingers were long, pale, and covered in blue inkstains. He did not hold a sword. In his lap lay a large, heavy book bound in calfskin, its corners capped with bright brass. "Sigurdsson," the Jarl said, his voice surprisingly clear for a man whose lungs were full of winter damp. He did not look up from the page. "You have broken my ships. You have burned my towers. You have brought the wild wolfcoats down to eat my cattle. And for what? A strip of frozen rock in the Hardinja?" Thorstein advanced down the center aisle, his boots leaving a trail of dark, wet mud on the clean rushes of the floor. Viper's tongue trailed by his side, its iron edge drawing a thin, red line across the planks. "For the law, Erik," Thorstein said, stopping 10 paces from the dais. "You killed Sigmund. You put his head on an ash post because he spoke the words of the free men at the Thingstead." The Jarl finally closed the book with a heavy thud. A small cloud of dust rose from the leather. He looked at Thorstein, his yellowed eyes sharp and full of an ancient, bitter intelligence. "Sigmund was a fool who lived in the songs of the grandfathers," Erik said, leaning forward, his dry skin rustling against the purple cloth. "The world is changing, Thorstein. The kings of the south do not ask 30 farmers if they may go to war. They do not hold a stone circle to see if the corn should be shared. They write it in the ledger. They count the iron. They take what they need, and they hang the man who grumbles." He pointed a long, blue-inked finger at the silver crosses on the pillars. "I built this town because the old ways are dead. The ships from the south do not buy songs, they buy leather, tallow, and peace. Sigmund wanted to keep the Hardinja wild. He wanted to keep it poor. He wanted to keep it free," Halvar shouted from behind Thorstein, his hand tightening around his spear haft until the wood creaked. The Jarl laughed, a wet, rattling sound that turned into a cough. "Free to starve in the winter, boy. Free to watch your children chew birch bark when the herring fails. Look out the window. Your free men are burning the grandest port in the north. You think you have won a kingdom? You have only won an ash heap. The shadow behind the seat." "The ash heap belongs to us now," Thorstein said, stepping onto the first tier of the high dais. "Get down from the seat, Erik. The crows have been waiting for your skin since the snow melted." "The crows will have to wait a little longer, Sigurdsson," a voice hissed from the darkness behind the high throne. From the shadow of the great tapestry that hung behind the Jarl's seat, a man stepped out. He was tall, thin, and wore a coat of black ringmail that had been oiled until it made no more sound than silk. His face was hidden behind a polished iron visor shaped like the skull of a raven, leaving only 2 small, dark slits for his eyes. In his right hand, he held a long, thin blade of southern steel, not a broad-bladed Norse sword, but a narrow, double-edged rapier that had been forged in the deep fireshops of the Franks. Thorstein's eyes narrowed. "Raffen." "The Jarl's shadow," the man behind the visor replied, his voice muffled by the steel. He stepped down from the dais, his long blade moving in a slow, hypnotic circle that caught the light of the tallow candles. "I was the one who drove the spike through your brother's throat, Thorstein." He shrieked like a wet gull before the iron took his tongue. Halvar roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred, and lunged forward with his spear. The thrust was fast, aimed at the center of the black mailshirt. But Raffen was not a man of the shield wall. He didn't block. He twisted his body with the grace of an adder, letting the spear point pass an inch from his hip, and brought the flat of his long blade down on Halvar's wrists. The iron hit the bone with a sharp crack. Halvar gasped, his fingers opening instantly as the spear clattered onto the floor. Before Raffen could drive the point through the boy's throat, Thorstein stepped between them, Viper's tongue coming up in a short, brutal arc that forced the black warrior to leap backward onto the stone flags.
Veldolv. Take the boy.
Thorstein growled, his right hand locking around his axe haft, his left arm hanging dead and heavy against his ribs.
He's mine.
The giant reached down, grabbing Halvar by the collar of his tunic and dragging him back toward the door as Wrath circled Thorstein like a black wolf around an old, wounded bull. "You have only one arm, Sigurdsson," Wrath whispered through the iron skull.
"How can an old dog hold a shield wall when he can't even hold his own reins?"
"I don't need a shield," Thorstein said, his grey eyes fixing on the eye slits of the iron mask.
"I only need one swing."
Chapter 12, The Night of the Valkyries. The great pillars of the hall began to sing their death song. Down in the harbor, the fire from the oil vats had reached the timber foundations of the lower town, and the smoke was rising through the floorboards of Alrekstad like grey serpents. The heat inside the Jarl's sand was a heavy, suffocating weight, smelling of hot iron, scorched resin, and the dry grease of the ancient tapestries that were already beginning to curl and blacken at the edges. "One arm is enough to butcher a shadow," Thorstein Sigurdsson said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, low rumble that the men of the Hardinge knew as the Jarnord, the Iron Word.
Rafn did not answer with words. He lunged.
The thin southern blade shot forward like a striking viper. It was a thrust meant for the soft flesh beneath the ear, bypassing the heavy hide of Thorstein's leather jerkin. Thorstein couldn't lift a shield to intercept it, so he did what only an old man who had looked into the iron for 30 winters would dare. He moved his head 3 inches to the left. The steel passed so close it sheared a lock of his grey hair, the flat of the blade cold against his cheekbone. Before Rafn could pull the rapier back into line, Thorstein swung Viper's tongue with his single good hand. He didn't aim for the head, he aimed for the thin, oiled links of black mail where the man's hip met the thigh.
Clang!
The bearded edge of the axe caught the black warrior flat against the bone. The iron links didn't burst, but the sheer, crushing weight of the Hardinge oak drove Rafn sideways, his boots sliding through the mud-streaked rushes of the floor.
"You're slow, old man." Rafn hissed through the iron mask, though his left leg dragged slightly as he circled back toward the high seat.
The king of the ghost ships. On the blue throne, Jarl Erik sat unmoving, his pale, ink-stained fingers resting on the brass corners of his calfskin ledger. He looked less like a ruler of men and more like a corpse that had been dressed in purple wool to scare the crows. "Kill him, Rafn," the Jarl muttered, his yellow eyes reflecting the orange glow of the floorboards.
"The fleet is gone. The town is gone. Let the old dog have his grave in the ashes." Rafn changed his stance.
He held the long, narrow sword with both hands now, his elbows tucked tight against his ribs, his iron visor tilted down until the eye slits were nothing but black needles. He did not rush. He advanced with short, sweeping steps, the point of his steel flickering in the firelight like a snake's tongue. He struck 3 times in the space of 2 breaths.
Fast, flat cuts aimed at Thorstein's unarmored throat, his hip, and his dead left shoulder.
Thorstein parried the first with the ash shaft of his axe, the wood whistling as the steel slid off its grain. He caught the second on the iron boss of his belt buckle, the impact sending a jar of cold pain through his broken ribs. But the third blow found its meat. The thin blade entered the muscle of his dead left arm, sliding straight through the old wound halter the black had given him.
Thorstein didn't flinch.
The nerves in that arm were already dead, frozen by the mountain cold and the salt rot. Instead of drawing back, Thorstein stepped forward, using his own dead flesh to trap the sword. He clamped his left arm down against his ribs, pinning Rafn's blade between his elbow and his flank. "Now," Thorstein whispered, his teeth red with his own deep blood. "You stay." The law of the bearded iron. Rafn's eyes widened behind the dark slits of the iron skull. He tried to wrench the rapier free, his boot heels digging into the oak planks, but the old bull of the Hardinge was too heavy. Thorstein lifted Viper's tongue high above his shoulder with his right arm. His muscles tore beneath his tunic, the hot blood spurting afresh from his collarbone, but his grip on the ash haft did not slip. "For Sigmund," Thorstein roared, his voice breaking into a wild, primal howl that woke the Ulfnar on the ridges outside.
The axe came down. It did not hit the mail.
It hit the center of the polished iron mask. The heavy, bearded wedge of bog iron split the skull visor down the nose bridge, crushing the bone and the steel inward with a sound like a frozen river cracking in the spring. Rafn went down without a shriek, his black-clad body falling across the base of the high dais, his hands twitching once in the rushes before his shadow mingled with the dark grease of the floor.
The sovereign of the ash heap.
The hall went very quiet, save for the roaring of the flames below the floor. Thorstein stood over the dead warrior, his chest heaving, his right hand dripping with a mixture of grease, salt water, and Rafn's brains. He reached down with his teeth, unbuckling the dead left arm from his flank, and let Viper's tongue rest its iron nose against the first step of the blue throne. He looked up at Jarl Erik.
The old man did not move.
He was staring at the calfskin book in his lap, his blue-inked fingers tracing the lines of Latin script as if looking for a word that could save him from the iron.
The book doesn't have my name in it, Erik, Thorstein said, his breath coming in long, wet gasps.
No, the Jarl said softly, his voice barely a rattle in his throat.
He did not look up. Your name is written in the mud.
It will be washed away by the first rain of winter, Sigurd's son. The kings of the south will come.
They will bring more books.
They will bring more iron than your small fjord can ever melt.
Let them come, Thorstein said.
He reached out with his right hand, grabbing the old man by the purple collar of his empire cloth, and hauled him from the high seat onto the floorboards.
He did not use the sacks. He did not use the axe.
He left the Jarl sitting in the dirt, surrounded by his silver crosses and his burning ledgers, while the fire began to eat the pillars of his grand town.
Thorstein turned his back on the throne.
He walked down the center aisle, his boots heavy, his grey beard matted with the soot of Alrekstad. The birth of the free fjord. Outside, the dawn was finally breaking over the western peaks, not grey and dull, but a bright, blinding crimson that turned the waters of the harbor into a sheet of beaten copper. The Hamdoi of Jarl Erik was nothing but blackened ribs sticking out of the mud. Thorkel the Tall and the Sunfjord men were standing on the stone piers, their arms full of silver-plated horse harnesses and iron swords they had pulled from the dead huskarls. Above them, on the high rocks, the wolfcoats were already turning back toward the high snows, their work done, their tokens paid in full. Halvar stood at the gatehouse, his wrists bound in dirty linen, but his eyes clear and wide as he saw his uncle step through the smoke of the great hall.
Uncle, the boy said, running to meet him. The Jarl, is he dead?
The Jarl is just an old man who forgot how to row, Thorstein said, letting Viper's tongue slide from his fingers into the black mud of the yard. He sat down heavily on a broken stone pillar, his grey eyes looking out past the burning town toward the open sea. He looked at Halvar, then at the younger men of the Hardinja who were gathering around him, their shields split, their faces hollowed by the iron madness, but their heads held high against the cold northern wind. The Lawstone is empty, Halvar, Thorstein said softly, his hand finding the boy's shoulder. The grandfathers are dead, and the kings of the south are coming. But until the sea turns to fresh water and the crows forget the smell of the sacks. He pointed his scarred finger toward the long, open mouth of the fjord, where the grey waves were rushing out to meet the great deep. The Hardinja belongs to the free men, Thorstein whispered.
Get to the oars, boy. We have a home to build.